for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Institute of World Politics. We are an independent graduate school of national security and international affairs. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Joseph Humire, the Executive Director of the Center for a Secure Free Society. The Center advances freedom and security by focusing on the nexus between security, intelligence, defense, and economic freedom. An 8-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps, Mr. Humire served combat tours in Iraq and Liberia, as well as participated in the first multinational training exercise in Latin America and the Caribbean. He is a specialist in regional security in the Western Hemisphere and is the co-editor of Iran's Strategic Penetration of Latin America. Please join me in welcoming Joseph Humire.
Well, thank you, Tanya, Katie, and the whole staff at the Institute. It's truly a pleasure to join you. I don't think this is my first visit at the Institute, but the office looks quite different than the last time I've been here. But let me just get settled. All right, well, thank you. Welcome. As Tanya mentioned, I direct the center here in Washington. It's kind of a new, I'd say I call it a global think tank, because I saw the trend of most traditional think tanks in the sense that they're somewhat inward focused. You have a staff of, 30, 40 analysts that look at the world from Washington's perspective outward. What we try to do is we try to look at the world globally through analysts and experts in other countries and bring that capital and knowledge here to Washington. This book and this research project is essentially an example of that. The book, which I think will be available for sale today, and there's also available on Amazon and other places, is actually, I'm the editor or co-editor of the book. The book is actually written by several prominent Latin American authors, scholars, military officers, congressmen, and others that I've worked with for more than a decade in the region, doing different types of research projects, analytical projects, and others. So anyways, that's a little bit about the center. Let me get into, but before I get right into the actual presentation, I want to state my purpose. So I'm going to be with you for the next hour or so. And so I have essentially two goals that I hope I accomplish in the next hour. The first is, this is the PowerPoint, the presentation, at least the formal part, is more of an informational briefing. So I very much believe that before we start to get into strategy and start to get into kind of a whole holistic concept of how we respond to certain threats, we need to be informed as to what that nature of that threat really is. Now that's a conversation that's been ongoing here in Washington, particularly with Iran, to a lesser degree with Latin America. But this is definitely a component of a bigger problem that I think we're dealing with here in the United States and elsewhere. And my second goal is to really present to you, I'm not sure, but I assume some of you may be Latin American specialists, some of you may not be Latin American specialists. For those that aren't, I'd like to present the region to you in a way perhaps that you haven't been exposed to. Latin America, which I've done a lot of work in over the years as a military officer, then later as an analyst, is increasingly growing anti-U.S. And increasingly growing hostile to U.S. actions. Iran is just one piece of that pie. There's many other actors, extra-regional and regional actors, that compose that problem. Iran's one, China could be another, Russia could be another, etc., etc. Iran in particular, and I'll cover this in the course of the presentation, in the last decade has attempted at least 3 attacks against U.S. or U.S. interests in the region. And I'll show you the attacks. Thankfully, they've all been foiled by U.S. intelligence and law enforcement authorities, along with our partners in Latin America. But the fact that they even attempted to attack the homeland in 3 different ways, some more creative than others, I think shows that there's a clear and present danger presented by Iran in the hemisphere, but that threat emanates from anti-U.S. hostile actors from Latin America. So essentially, those are my 2 goals. First, I want to inform you. Second, I want to present the threat. So with that, let's get started. For those of you that are policy wonks or like to follow the policy debate here in Washington, there is a component that's related to this issue that is very much delves into the policy of State Department, the administration, and also Congress. So the biggest piece of policy, the biggest implication of policy here in Washington related to the Iran-Latin America portfolio is a bill that became law called the 2012 Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act. Essentially, that became Public Law 12-220. That law, which was signed into effect in January 2013, mandated that the State Department do a sort of net assessment, kind of comprehensive review of the nature of Iran's presence activities in Latin America. The law actually stated 12 elements that the State Department had to compile, assess, and review and plan for related to Iran's presence in the Western Hemisphere. In June of 2013, the State Department completed with their mandate, submitted, I think, about a 7-page classified report, followed with an appendix or an amendment, unclassified annex, and an intelligence impact assessment, which very much flew in the face of all the research I've been doing, and I was quite shocked that they did that. Their ultimate conclusion was that Iran's presence and their activities in Latin America was on the decline. That they acknowledge that they're there. They said that they have some activities, perhaps some that are nefarious and worrisome, but that it's not advancing as they would like. Their main reasoning for that assessment, for that statement, was the fact that they examined all the different types of agreements that existed between Iran and probably about a half a dozen Latin American countries. Agreements on economic trade, agreements in diplomacy and culture exchange, even military-to-military exchange. But what happened is when they looked at the letters of the agreements and saw what Iran was promising or said that they were going to do, and then looked at the actual transfers and activities that were on the ground with these host countries, they realized that Iran hadn't fulfilled many of its promises. That is true. Iran doesn't fulfill many of its promises. But I think it's important to note, to understand the nature of Iran, and many individuals actually helped me understand this, of how Iran acts globally. One individual I'd like to acknowledge is former Undersecretary of Terrorism for the Department of Treasury, Stuart Levy, who said that Iran always has a dual-use nature to its actions. So there's something that it says it does, that's seen. There are other things that it doesn't say it does, which are unseen. Now, it's the unseen actions that were more my concern, were more my interest is, and what's engaged in this research project. So if on the surface you see, I think the number is upwards of about 500 agreements that they've signed with about 6 or 7 Latin American countries. So if you see these 500 agreements, and you see that a lot of them haven't come to fruition on the surface, the question is what are these agreements setting up to do beneath the surface? What is this military agreement setting up that Iran's not talking about publicly? Because they love to talk about the show, the political posturing, all the different arrangements. I think one of their ambassadors said it, I think, perfectly as a talking point. He said, as the United States is attempting to build a wall between Latin America and the United States, referencing Mexico, Iran is trying to build a bridge. And so they play this into the ears of many Latin Americans, but don't really tell the full story. So, in essence, I think the fact that you didn't see much evidence when you look on the surface as to the problems that of Iran, Latin America, it's encompassed upon not just the intelligence community, us as analysts, congressmen, and all those in policy, to look beneath the surface and find that evidence, because it does exist. Here in D.C., I think when this really came to the attention of most of us in Washington, at least in the media and others, when in October 2011, some of you might remember this, a gentleman, Iranian-American based out of Corpus Christi, Texas, was arrested in New York on an attempt to fly to Iran because apparently he was involved in a terrorist plot to bomb the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. here in Washington at some restaurant downtown. The investigators that looked into this plot, which was very kind of almost like a movie. The gentleman, the Iranian American that was arrested, supposedly had subcontracted to a Mexican drug cartel that turned out to be a DEA agent or informant. Had received a $100,000 wire transfer to engage the operation. But I think the real nail in the coffin that led to his arrest was the fact that that $100 wire transfer came from his reported cousin, who was an Iranian operative from the Quds Force, from the paramilitary wing of the Revolutionary Guards, Ghulam Shukuri. Now, this case in itself, he's in jail now, the Iranian American from Corpus Christi, but this case opened the eyes to a lot of people because it said, okay, there's a lot of things that don't really make sense here. You know, why is Iran attacking Saudi Arabia in D.C., and why are they using a Mexican cartel to do it? A lot of different moving parts, a lot of different worlds that people don't necessarily understand. I can't validate this case or say much to it, but what I can say is that the fact that you saw two different elements, you know, Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Mexican or Latin American transnational criminal elements coming together, it wasn't a new phenomenon. Maybe it was in the sense of the media when they reported on this case, but what this served to do is really open the eyes of many people in the media and policy and other analysts here in Washington to say there might be a problem here beneath the south of the border. So in essence, this was an opportunity, it's kind of where I began, to start really engaging the public sphere and start talking about some of what I've been seeing over the last few years. There's probably three distinct eras that you could talk about when you're talking about Iran-Latin America relationship. There's the pre-1979, the pre-Iranian Revolution era. So Iran has engaged in Latin America for a century. The majority of that time was before that Iran was the Islamic Republic, with the Shah and before the Shah. I believe Venezuela and Iran first began their relationship when they both created OPEC. So one era is the pre-1979, pre-revolution era. The second is the post-revolution era, post-1979. In that era, the first country, so when Iran had its revolution in 1979, they had, I believe it's 6 embassies established in the region. Most of the embassies froze their relationship because they weren't sure what to make of this new Islamic Republic. The first embassy that re-engaged and reopened diplomatic relations was actually Cuba in 1982. So when we talk about the modern era of Iran-Latin America relations, it began with Cuba. Fidel Castro and Ayatollah Khamenei were the first 2 individuals that really came to contact and decided to forge a stronger bond. That's an important data point if we talk about Iran-Latin America today in a post-Chavez world. Many people believe that Iran-Latin America relationship was a result of personality politics. Hugo Chavez, the charismatic leader, autocrat caudillo from Venezuela, and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad from Iran, who had very similar characteristics, a former military man, a populist, and an autocrat. Yes, there was a personal relationship between the two, but we have to remember that this relationship started way before Hugo Chavez came to power, as it did before Ahmadinejad. So those are the 2 eras, pre-1979, post-1979, and then the third era, which is the focus of most of the book and most of my research, is the post-2004. Now, 2004 has a significance in two areas. One is that was the beginning of formation of a political power project known as the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas, otherwise known as ALBA. That power project, for those that don't know it, is an alliance, a political economic alliance between, well, there's 5 major countries in the alliance and there's about 4 satellite countries in the Caribbean. So about 9 countries in total throughout Latin America, beginning with Venezuela and Cuba, who decided to come together and project their power through the region to unify themselves so that they could stand against the U.S. and the West. Hugo Chavez, if you want to look at his tenure, he began his presidency in 1999 up until 2013 when he passed away. The first block of that presidency was consolidating power within the country. The second block of that presidency, post-2004 when he created the ALBA, was to consolidate power throughout the entire region. He converted Bolivia through the presidency of Evo Morales, Nicaragua through the resurgence of Daniel Ortega, Ecuador through a populist named Rafael Correa, and later started to make moves in other satellite countries in the Caribbean, essentially turning the OAS on its head, because every Caribbean country in the OAS has the same vote as another country, so it renders it ineffective. The last point I kind of want to make on this topic is as this relationship grows, obviously the ALBA has been the core of it. So these 5 countries plus these Caribbean satellites are the core of Iran's partners in the region. Iran actually is an observing member of the alliance, has signatory authority in the ALBA project, and they always have a representative member in any ALBA. ALBA meets about once a year. They have political forums and other types of soapbox, and Iran is always visible, as is Syria, by the way. But there are other countries that Iran has engaged in over the years that I think are just as important, and while they might not be formally part of the ALBA alliance, they are Bolivarian-like. Most notably is Argentina, for those that follow the politics of their president, Cristina Fernandez Kirchner. You know that she might not be formally part of Hugo Chavez's alliance, but she definitely emulates some of his politics. She also goes on TV a lot, she also destroys her economy, she also goes after journalists, and she's very much following the playbook as it was written. Brazil, who just recently had an election, Brazil is Iran's largest trade partner, as it is the largest trade partner in many countries in the world, because it's one of the largest countries in Latin America. Brazil is an interesting case study because Brazil kind of plays all sides towards the middle. If you go to Brazil, they'll say they're friends of the U.S. If Iran goes to Brazil, they'll say they're friends of Iran. Brazil wants to be a friend with everyone, but if you dig deep into Brazilian politics, you know that the political power that brought Dilma Rousseff to the presidency and her predecessor Lula da Silva, it's core to the communist movement in Latin America. It's very closely aligned with Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, and the rest. So they have an ideological affinity with the Iranian Revolution and with Iran. Even on the surface, they can't present that publicly because they have the World Cup, they have the Summer Olympics. They have an image that they have to project that's much different than what their true nature really is. So the last point is that, and this I think is making more sense now when we're seeing a post-Ahmadinejad era in Iran, is partners like Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and others are increasingly important. Historically, it isn't the Alba countries that Iran has been wanting to go after. They work with them because you go to the dance with those who will dance with you. But reality is they want Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico within their geopolitical orbit because those are the geopolitical prize for their power project. In the book, I think it's in chapter 10 somewhere, I kind of describe a little bit of the strategic aspect of it because, I mean, hence the title, it's Iran's strategic penetration of Latin America. And in the book and in that chapter, what I try to make a case is to say that if you look at Iran and their actions and their activities, you have about a 30-year data set from about 1982, 83 to the present day of all the activities they've done through time. And if you start to examine it and kind of segment it into different blocks, you get a trend line that kind of looks like this. Now this is from 2004 to 2012, but in reality you could extend that to 30 years. And it could be a macro and a micro model. What I mean by that is I say it could be a macro model in the sense that you could look at this at the range of over 30 years through all the countries in the region that they've engaged. And you could look at a micro model as an individual country. So you could take Bolivia, for instance, or Venezuela, for instance, and examine how Iran has cultivated and established relationships in that country, and you follow the same model. The model goes as follows. What Iran looks for when they first come into any country in Latin America, let's stick with the micro first, since, when I study economics, they always say, there's macro problems for micro solutions. So let's stick with the micro. If Iran was to say, come into, let's just use Bolivia, for example, comes into Bolivia, the first thing they'll do is establish relationships with the Islamic communities, however small it is, be it, a place like Brazil with 1 million Muslims, or be it a place like Bolivia with probably 100,000, if that. They'll establish a relationship with the Muslim communities looking for two things: political projections and access to wealth. Some of these communities have very prominent businessmen, have very prominent export-import type activity, so the access to funds and wealth, and those that are access to the political players, to establish some type of base of support. Once they get enough of that access, they tend to establish formal diplomatic and economic channels. That's where you actually see, in the countries where you see an embassy start up, it's because they've had some success on the cultural realm. They've had some success with the soft penetration. And then once they have the formal channels, the commercial agreements and the diplomatic exchange necessary, is where you start to see the entrance of military personnel. Now, there's only two countries that I know of in Latin America that actually went through this whole spectrum, and that's Venezuela and Bolivia. Both in Venezuela and Bolivia, you see an unprecedented amount of military, both formal and informal, personnel in the country. That's completely unprecedented in the region. That never happened in the 80s, in the 90s, and it definitely hasn't happened only in the recent last 5 years. But what I see this as is I see this as a pattern to try to understand Iran's intent and what they're actually trying to do by coming to Latin America. And as I interpret and understand it today, I see their intent as part of one aspect of what they're doing around the world, which is building legitimacy. So Iran today, in Latin America, I see it very much at an inflection point. It's at a point where it's pretty much had a holding pattern. They've gained a lot of access thanks to the Alba, but the Alba's kind of fledgling. It's on its downslide. Hugo Chavez passed away last year. Since his death, there hasn't been a clear leader emerge, at least within their project. Hence, Iran has kind of kept a holding pattern. That doesn't mean that they're on decline. That just means that they're waiting to see where the chips fall and where the dust settles and seeing where they're going to leverage their investments. I think this year, and particularly next year, you're going to see where some of those movements are going to take place. But essentially, the big project is about building legitimacy. And that's no different than what they're doing in Africa, no different than what they're doing in Asia, in Europe, and elsewhere. They're on a global public diplomacy campaign. And the more allies they can get in Latin America that let them do this, unimpeded. And I should re-emphasize that this isn't unbeknownst to the Latin American countries. This isn't with the Bolivian government not knowing that this is happening. This is with the support of certain Latin American countries. So I think their big campaign is the legitimacy, and their legitimacy in Latin America that not only depends on their actions and their image, it depends on the actions and image of their host partners in the region. So as long as Evo Morales is the president of Bolivia, if he has legitimacy that capitalizes his power in the country, Iran will always have a solid partner. That's why they invest in certain elections and in certain political players that help them establish that presence. So let's get a little bit into the actual case of Iran. So for me, the story really begins in the 90s. Some of you might be familiar with this case. This is probably, don't quote me, but I think this is probably the largest Islamic terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere before September 11th. For those that don't know, I'm referring to the 1994 attacks on the Amia Culture Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. There was actually an attack 2 years earlier on the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires as well. Altogether, with 2 attacks, you had 114 people killed, mainly Argentinians, Jewish Argentinians, and several hundred more injured. The Ami attack in particular, which was the more devastating of the 2, which I think that was about 85 people killed, was a complete disaster in terms of the investigation and the attempts to actually seek justice for the victims. The initial investigations compiled to nothing. Really just, false accusations, rumors, innuendo, everything from as high as the president of Argentina was accused to local police that were corrupt. Really no real solid evidence to bring any indictments, hence everything just kind of fell on its face. About close to a decade later, around 2004, it was Nestor Kirchner, the president at the time, the then president of Argentina, who relaunched an investigation among the pressure mainly of the Jewish community, who is consistently and persistently seeking justice for the victims of this attack, relaunched an investigation that was prosecuted by an investigator named Alberto Nisman. Alberto Nisman determined, and he did with over 2 years of investigation with significant amount of resources and a lot of travel to Iran, to Europe, also within South America, that there was 8 individuals that were implicated, not just in the actual bombing. The people that bombed the Amia were dead. The other ones that were closely related from the tri-board area have been arrested. But the actual people that planned and carried out the execution of the attack were still at large, and he identified 8 of them, 7 of which being from Iran, 1 being Lebanese, who I believe is dead now. Of these 7 individuals, if you look at, they're right there, if you look at who they are, these aren't your everyday random criminal Iranian. These are very prominent people. One of them, Ahmad Bahidi, just recently was stepped down from being the Minister of Defense. He was the Minister of Defense under the Ahmadinejad tenure. 2 of them ran for president in the last Iranian elections in 2012. Ali Akbar Velayati and Mohsen Rezai. Ali Akbar Velayati was a strong contender. I mean, if Rouhani didn't win, I think he might have been the president of Iran. So these are individuals that are heavily protected by the Iranian government, and obviously have never been questioned or indicted in this attack. They all have what they call a red notice from Interpol, meaning that their passports are frozen, they can't leave the country, at least not under their real name. But there's one individual here that the prosecutor identified as what he called the mastermind of this attack, an individual that he said really was the one that really, the brainchild to create the attack and to orchestrate it, and that's Mohsen Rabbani, this individual right here. He's a very interesting case study because to me he's one of the most successful terrorists in the world, yet one of the most least known terrorists in the world. The Brazilians call him the terrorist professor. Mohsen Rabbani came to Argentina from Iran in 1984 under the guise of a commercial attaché. So he was sent to Iran as a commercial he was sent to Argentina as a commercial attaché, supposedly to inspect the livestock because there was a lot of trade of agriculture from Argentina to Iran. But he used that cover to establish a mosque and an Islamic culture center, the first major big mosque in Argentina and culture center that belonged to Iran. And he also used that to do what I mentioned in that model, to infiltrate the Islamic community. Shortly after he arrived in Argentina, he created this culture center called the Asia. So at the time, Argentina had different Islamic communities. It had a Syrian community, a Lebanese community, a Pakistani community, and they're all kind of spread out, which is near this tri-board area, the southern corner of Argentina. He unified these communities, he indoctrinated them, and he became a leader of the Islamic community. in Argentina. He then started to work towards engaging the politicians in Argentina. I mean, we're talking about a 10-year operation. He arrived in 84, the attacks didn't happen until 94. He was in the country for 10 years, and it wasn't until the last 6 months of his time in Argentina that they gave him diplomatic immunity so he could leave. In the last 6 months before Moshe Rabbani left Argentina, then he became the culture attaché to the Iranian embassy in Buenos Aires, giving him that diplomatic protection so that, you know, they knew once the time the bomb goes off that he can leave the country without any questions through customs and other places. Reportedly left through Chile, and supposedly after the attack left and hasn't been back, although we know that not to be true. So a lot of times when I talk about that case, the Humire case, for those that are interested in this topic, is very important to understand the study. There's plenty of documentation on it. Niesmann's reporting has been very helpful into understanding that case. But there's certain precedents that you take from that case and you carry it forward to what's happening today. Here's a case that's very less well known. This is linked to the other one, and I'll explain why. But you know, the other one was, okay, that was an attack that happened in the 90s. Granted, there's no there hasn't been any convictions, but you know, you're talking more than 20 years ago. How does that relate to what's the Iranian threat in Latin America today? Well, here's a more recent case. This is a case in 2007, so we're talking more than a decade later. It's a case in 2007 where attempted terrorist attack was going to happen in Buenos Aires. I'm sorry, in New York City. The attack was to blow up the JFK International Airport by setting several bombs on the gas pipelines underneath the airport. This would have been devastating. Perhaps bigger than 9/11 if they were able to pull it off. The individuals that were arrested in the attack were a terrorist group that was identified in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, but mandated through a leader in Guyana, a gentleman named Abdul Qadir. Real name is Michael Seaforth. He had converted to Islam in the 80s, became a prominent Islamic figure in the Caribbean, but also became a prominent political figure in Guyana. He became the mayor of Linden, a very popular city. He also became a parliamentarian for several times. But when you look into the case and you dive deep into the records of the case, you get to notice to see where Abdul Qadir really began his conversion and his radicalization to radical Islam. And what you see in the case is that he had a very long-standing and close relationship to Moshe Rabbani. If you look at the case, you actually read the letters of Qadir to Rabbani, empathizing, you know, his persecution, they call his persecution by the international and Argentinian authorities. He sent his daughters to live with Rabbani in Iran for a period of time. Was very much, I mean, you know, safe to say they were very good friends. And so he was working as a politician in Guyana for several years before he even attempted to try to do this attack that thankfully got foiled by law enforcement intelligence authorities. But the important part of the Qadir case to me is it serves as a prototype. Because in the Humire case, the people that carried out the attack and the people that actually, you know, executed the bombing were Iranians or Lebanese or Syrian individuals from the Middle East into the region that carried out the operation. In the Qadir case, you're talking about indigenous Latin Americans, people that are actually from Latin America that are now carrying out terrorist attacks on behalf of Iran. It's a completely different modus operandi, a lot harder to detect. I mean, obviously a Guyanese person from Guyana, born and raised, with prominence is going to be able to hide and deflect any suspicion much easier than a foreigner. And so the Qadir case, to me, serves as a prototype, which just happened in 2006-07, but he was recruited in the 80s, so over 20 years of his infiltration in Latin America, serving as an agent in Iran, serves as a prototype for what exists today. So this is a picture, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the magazine Veja from Brazil. So it's a very, it's like the Time magazine of Brazil. It's a very prominent magazine, and Veja did a very interesting and very excellent expose of Iran's presence, or not just Iran, Islamist presence in Brazil, which it's the most, well, Brazil is one of the largest countries in terms of population in Latin America. It also has one of the largest Islamic populations in the region. But then when they started to expose this network, what they found out that Moshe Rabbani had visited Brazil at least twice in the last 5 years. There you can see a picture of him. This is a picture from the magazine of Moshe Rabbani in Iran. He's the gentleman in the center. Everybody around him aren't Middle Easterners. They're all Latin Americans, be it from Argentina, from Brazil, from other places. And what really caught my eye was, why was he visiting Iran? Obviously, he has a red notice, Interpol red notice. He can't be in the country, so he had to fly under an alias. Authorities reported that he was coming in through Venezuela. But the reason he was coming into Brazil was because this whole time, since the Almi attack and before, his actual brother was living in Curitiba, Brazil, Mohamed Bakar Rabbani. So his brother, his younger brother, had been doing the same operation that Moshe Rabbani had been doing. I wouldn't say undetected from authorities in Brazil. I think the Brazilians knew. Actually, I know the Brazilians knew that he was there. But as many Brazilians have told me, they prefer to be a hub than a target to Islamist terrorist attacks. So they kept him under supervision and watch, but they didn't ever neutralize or stop any of his activities. His activities were very much the same as Moshe Rabbani's: the soft penetration, the indoctrination, the proselytization, all those activities that lead eventually to more hardcore operations. Pay attention to this individual, because we're going to get into him. So I look at him as the new Moshe Rabbani in Latin America. So this is a limited version of a larger map that we've been working for 2-3 years, of mapping the network that exists in Latin America today related to Iran's formal and informal presence. If you look at the black dots, that's where Iran has their embassies. If you look at the red dots, that's where there's free trade zones, which are pretty prominent throughout Latin America. And the individuals there are individuals that we've identified that are working just like Abdul Qadir did in Guyana, just like other individuals have done, his brother did in Brazil, that are doing this type of soft penetration, the soft power work in Latin America, particularly in South America. I don't know if anyone's caught this in the news over the last week, but in Peru, which is a country that's very much not in the conversation when we talk about Iran, Latin America, authorities in Peru just arrested a Hezbollah agent in Lima this last week with explosives, TNT and detonators and other, in his house on the tip of apparently Israeli intelligence. They're still interrogating the individual, but they say that he had a target to blow up the Israeli embassy in Lima. This just happened this week, and so this shocked a lot of people because, maybe Venezuela, maybe Bolivia, maybe even Brazil, but Peru. Well, you see an individual there from Peru. His name is Edgar Hussein Vargas. Iran's been president in Peru for many years, very invisible. If you look at that model, that old model that I was showing you, the trend line, the spectrum, in Peru, they're very much in the cultural stage. They haven't advanced the diplomatic and economic. They don't have an embassy there. They don't have a real real formal agreement with the Peruvian government, much less their military personnel. But where do they have? They have it in the next door country in Bolivia. And that allows them to operate kind of unimpeded through the southern part of Peru. So when I heard the news, it really wasn't a surprise. Actually, I frankly thought that would be one of their target countries, Peru or Colombia, where I think they're very closely casing. But this is a small example of that network that I think this is not even close to what it really exists, but it gives you an example of what we're looking at and tracking to make sure we understand how these networks operate. Now, this is the individual I showed you in that last picture. I think you pay attention to him because he's very public. He's an individual, he goes on TV. Iran has a public information campaign that they put out through Latin America. It's a Spanish-speaking broadcast called Hispan TV. It's based out of Tehran and Madrid, and they broadcast, I think, through 16 countries in Latin America in Spanish, talking about everything from, Islamic guidance to actual operation, things that are happening in the Middle East that are projecting it to Latin America from their perspective. Well, he has a show on that network. His name is Suhail Assad. His show is called Open Dialogue, which it's like a terrorism TV show. He brings on people from Latin America, and then part of that network that we're mapping is by watching his show. He brings on people from Latin America to talk about things of interest to their specific countries. Just so you get the sense of the background of Suhail Assad was Rabbani's disciple in Argentina. So when Rabbani lived in Argentina in the 80s, before he did the Almi attack, Suhail Assad was a kid, and he used to help him with the radio programs, with all the public information campaigns that would go out to the Islamic communities. His brother-in-law, which is through his mother is a sister of the other individual that's on this picture, Abdul Karim Pas, was Rabbani's right-hand man. Now, Abdul Karim Pas is a little older now. He's still active, but I don't think he's doing as much publicly as he used to. Suhail Assad is, I think he's 39 years old, speaks Farsi, Arabic, French, Spanish, English. He has a PhD in Islamic theology. He spends half his time in Qum, Iran, which is a holy city in Iran, half his time in Caracas, Venezuela, where he manages the largest cultural center, the Iranian Latin America Exchange. And he's present in just about every country in Latin America. Actually, he was in Peru in 2012 way before this attack, or this Hezbollah terrorist came in last week. So he's an individual, I think, that's doing a lot of the work that Rabbani is, but again, like the Qatar model, he's an Argentinian, native Argentinian. When you hear him speak Spanish, he speaks flawlessly like an Argentinian. He's completely accepted amongst the academic Islamic communities all throughout the region, and he has a very public profile, but he's very hard to really track and detain. The Mexican authorities actually, I think, stopped him at one point because too many red flags were popping up under his name, which I think forced him to move down to Salvador. But anyhow, that's just a small example of what I think the network is looking at today. So let's go back to how this maps out in the region. This is basically what Iran's presence, formal presence, in Latin America looked like 2004 or pre-2004. You had 6 embassies spread throughout the region. A lot of these embassies established relationship before the revolution, so they were embassies that were established all through the 1900s. Kept the relationships once the Ayatollahs came to power. But you got to remember, this took about 50 or more years to establish all these embassies and presence, which is not a lot, but for a country that doesn't have a whole lot of relationships with this region, it's probably more than they need. Within 5 years, between 2004 and 2009, they almost doubled their presence in the region, establishing 5 more embassies for a total of 11 embassies, which is way more than they need as far as actual presence and activities that they're doing. If they're doing 500 agreements, they don't need 11 embassies. The 2 embassies that I'd say are probably the most important in the region, or at least the most active, are Venezuela and Bolivia. Many of you probably heard about Venezuela and know a little bit about Venezuela, seen all the chaos that's gone on recently, particularly this year with the riots and everything. Well, Venezuela was, for all intents and purposes, the gateway for Iran and Latin America. They established the biggest relationship, and Hugo Chavez was very much an admirer of the Iranian Revolution and viewed the Ayatollahs as a recipe for success. But in the aftermath of his death, and all of the political instability that exists in Caracas today, I think that's changing, and it's changing gradually. Bolivia is becoming more and more important. This past June, I was at a summit that's called the G77. For those that know, it's the G8, the G20, pretty much everybody else. It's some nasty individuals at the summit. Mugabe from Zimbabwe, there's others. But at that summit, which was held in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, Evo Morales was heralded as the leader of the South-South movement, basically the Latin America, Africa, Middle East. The ties between this movement and the ability to project his image worldwide as kind of a Nelson Mandela of the world, because he's the first indigenous president in Latin America, first indigenous president in Bolivia, an individual that rose from the bottom to the top. Iran loves his image and are investing into him and his political projections very much. Just to give you an example, our last visit to Bolivia, we were able to determine that there's about 500 formal, this is on record, Iranian officials in the embassy in La Paz. In contrast, Spain, which has long-standing relationship with Bolivia, has 15 or 12 to 15 diplomats in country. Then that's the formal number. The informal number, I believe, to be well above 1,000 Iranian officials or operatives operating out of La Paz. So there's quite a dense presence in that country. I'm going to rush through these. I have limited time, so I'm going to rush through these last slides because I want to get to the final point. But essentially, if you look at it from a geostrategic angle, the historic region where Iranians were operating in Latin America was the tri-border area. You've heard me reference it a few times. That's the intersection between Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. That has a long-standing presence of Islamists and others. That's been surpassed by Margarita Island in Venezuela because it's also a free trade zone, as is the tri-border area, but Venezuela offers that state protection and state support. But going in line with what I said earlier about Bolivia, about Peru, I believe this is to be an area that needs more attention, which is a new tri-border area, which, according to some authorities, tell me that has the same makings as the old tri-border area in terms of lack of oversight, lack of real enforcement capabilities, and I think is emerging as a weak point or an access point that if Venezuela can provide as the gateway for Iran, then that could be potentially its back door. So this is I'm going to rush through this because I really want to get to this last point. The Venezuela, I mean, you would be amazed at the kind of presence that Iran has in Venezuela, which is not just within the Venezuelan population, it's within the Venezuelan government. These are individuals that all have one tie or another to Iran. They're either Syrian or Lebanese descent. but they belong in the Venezuelan government, holding important, powerful positions such as the general of the commander of the military industry, to the minister of interior, to others, and I call them like a Middle Eastern mafia within the Venezuelan government. The most prominent of these individuals is this gentleman, Tariq El-Assami, and we'll talk to him about him in a second. You've heard of these flights, perhaps, these Iran-Venezuelan flights that were running for about 3 years. These are flights that really had no passengers, really did not have much activity, but yet were operating on a weekly basis. We looked at some of these flights. If you look at the actual activity, they ran a net loss of more than $3 million. Yet they were continually being funded and operated. My suspicion was they were being used to extract minerals and to insert their operatives. Moshe Rabbani was rumored to be on one of these flights when he went to Brazil. And this is the point I want to make. So the point I want to make is, up until now, I've talked a little bit about the soft penetration, the cultural exchange, all that stuff. We know about that, the mosques, the culture centers. Then you move into how they use that power to actually project a bigger influence in the region by establishing more embassies. You went from 6 to 11. They established agreements, exchange. But then you start to see the true nature of the Iranian regime, which you have to remember, more than 50% of Iran's production today is in some way or another tied to the IRGC, meaning that the military industry controls a large part of the petro industry in Iran. That's also the case to some degree in Venezuela. This is a map of the northern part of the Caribbean ports of Venezuela. All the black dots are the military bases, the major military bases in Venezuela. This is where Iran has major military presence in the country, where they have big projects. This is a presentation in itself, so I'm just going to give you the upshot. The upshot is every single military project that Iran has in Venezuela has a dual-use nature. Meaning, if they're building UAVs in Maracay, yes, they do build a UAV in Maracay, but they also build something else. If they're building chemical plants in Moron, yes, they do have chemical plants in Moron, but that Moron base serves for something else. Establishing the logistical links between these military activities to understand what exactly they're trying to do is the job of analysts and officials today, to really understand exactly what it is they're trying to do. Not coincidentally, along where all these military projects exist in Venezuela is where all the commercial ventures exist. You might have heard of a tractor factory in Venezuela called Iran, a joint tractor factory, or a joint auto manufacturing facility that produces cars, Iranian cars in Venezuela. Neither of these sell a lot. I mean, they both run deficits and they're both in black for many years. But they're strategically located all along these military ports. And what we come down to at the end, we come down to a sort of production line. A production line that moves minerals, materials, weapons, and other types of things related to Iran. Not so much their nuclear program, but their ballistic missile program in and out of Venezuela. That last state right in the corner, right there in the hub where that red dot is, where it says Aragua State, the reason why that's strategically located right there is important was because earlier in the presentation when I mentioned that minister, the Minister of Interior, Tariq El-Assami, he controls that region. He's the governor of that region. And he, to me, is probably the most dangerous individual in Venezuela next to the Assembly President, Diosdado Cabello. So this is an example of the military presence that they have in the region, but it also extends to a paramilitary presence. Bolivia and Venezuela have seen a rise of besieged paramilitary forces in their country. Here's a picture of 2009 when Venezuela signed a mill-to-mill agreement to do defense cooperation, which I find is normal. There's nothing wrong with that. But in this picture, you see an individual that doesn't look like the others, and he has a khaki uniform. That's General Nagdi, who is the commander of the besieged paramilitary force of Iran in Venezuela. You also saw Nagdi later in Bolivia when they inaugurated Asymmetric School of Defense. The major point I'm trying to make here is that the level of escalation of Iran's presence and activities in Latin America is reaching to levels that are completely unwarranted and unprecedented. They have an ability to now work within certain countries at a level that far outweighs the capacity of the United States. In Bolivia, for example, where our embassy is considerably shrinking and our capacities in the countries are pretty much diminished, Iran is replacing us in things like counter-narcotics and things like defense cooperation and things like satellite building and UAV production. And they're doing it at the expense of the Latin Americans themselves. Now, why would these Latin American countries do it? Well, there's many reasons. We can get to some of that in the Q&A, but frankly, a lot of it has to do with just straight cold hard cash. Many people have told me Chavez received, outside of just the agreements, has received more than $30 million personal from the Iranian government to be able to carry out some of these operations. So I'll end with this, and then we can open up the floor to some questions in a few minutes. But the main thrust of this point is that, and I used to box when I used to be in the Marine Corps, and there's an old saying in boxing that it's the punch you don't see that knocks you out. And if you look at the map in the world of the way Iran is operating globally, I think Latin America is that weak point. It's that area that the United States pays less attention to, largely considered a foreign policy backwater for the United States. It's the area that probably we have the least amount of presence, engagement, losing a lot of allies daily on a weekly basis. It's the area where our adversaries are most concentrated. Don't take it from me, a lot of my colleagues that do Iran for a living, study Iran for a living, say the presence in Latin America probably outweighs the presence in most other regions. But that said, that part of the conversation where we end talking about Iran, Latin America, is where we start to begin to talk about Russia and Latin America, China, Latin America. Because the conventional wisdom is these are three separate phenomenons, but from my perspective, I think there's more cooperation than conflict. Thank you.
There's some time for questions. If you could please state your name and affiliation before your question.
Yes, I'm Russell King, federal employee. I was wondering, does Iran have any relationships with small Caribbean countries whereby they get passports so that Iranians can travel in the Western Hemisphere under the passport of a small Caribbean island as opposed to Iranian passport?
Yes, the answer is yes. There's actually a part of the slide I don't think I got to, but there's a policy report separate from the book that's here. I have a few copies I can give to you. It's called Canada on Guard. It's about immigration security. What the policy report focuses on is on an immigration scheme between Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and other countries where they provide legitimate documentation, immigration documentation, passports, visas, and other type of IDs for that Iranian, not just Iranians, but Syrian, Lebanese, and other Islamic militants can travel throughout the region. That has extended into the Caribbean, most notably Belize. Belize has the same kind of operation they have in Venezuela, where the authorities actually provide legitimate documentation to people from Iran and other places. The most prominent case that you might want to look at is the case of a gentleman named Rafiq Laboon, who he was trafficking human smuggling individuals from Venezuela all the way up to California. He was actually known to be, I think, an imam at a mosque in San Francisco. He was arrested in Merida, Mexico, because it pretty much disrupted his smuggling network. But my understanding was that opened up a huge can of worms in Belize because they found out they weren't doctor documents. They were actually given by Belize authorities. And so the big question was, is that a corrupt individual within the Belizean government, or is that a larger scheme? Now, I can't say this with any definitive nature. I don't know, to be honest with you. But my sense is I think the Venezuelans were paying the Belizean government to provide that service.
Lieutenant Colonel from the Polish Embassy. I just wanted to ask you, first of all, thank you for the most interesting presentation. Three things. A ballistic missile program was possibly conducted in Latin America. You mentioned something about the science, if you could go deeper. The second question is, how is Iran financing all these activities in terms of economic problems? And just short remark, how can you account for this Iranian activity and the goal, the global legitimacy? I mean, if you stage terrorist attacks in the country, you will not get legitimacy.
Yeah, sure.
In my view.
Okay, let me just make sure I got them. The first question was related to ballistic missile activity. Just expand a little bit more on that. The second one is how are they financing some of these activities? Correct. Yeah. And the third is, how does their terrorist operations conflict with their global campaign for legitimacy? Okay. On the first question, so I'll reemphasize this. I'm not saying that Iran was building any type of missile capability in Latin America. I know that was reported. I think it was a German newspaper that put out that said that Venezuela had missile silos developed by Iran that were at the Paraguay Peninsula aimed at the United States. We examined that very thoroughly. Like I said, that one slide is a whole hour presentation that I've given to our intelligence authorities and others. The conclusion that we came to, they don't have the capacity to do that. That doesn't mean they don't want to. Maybe they did. I don't know. but they just, they didn't have the logistical capabilities to pull something like that off. It's a very difficult task. But what they did have was the ability to extract resources to move to feed the ballistic missile program in the homeland. So as you know, we talk a lot about Iran's nuclear program and the growth, but we can't forget that that's Iran's projected power, right? Iran's current power belongs within the ballistic missile program. They're one of, or maybe the largest missile power in the Middle East. I believe they're more powerful than Israel, with the largest short-range to medium-range ballistic missiles, the Shahabs and others. The more that program grows, the more it has to eat. And the more it has to eat is the more resources it needs. And outside of things that relate to their nuclear program like uranium, there's plenty of minerals in Latin America that apply to the missile program. Thorium, lithium, Bolivia is probably the lithium capital of the world, tantalum and others. So in that sense, that's, I believe, how they're helping their missile program from Latin America. As far as the financing, that's interesting. One of their drawbacks was the sanctions. This I do agree with the State Department in this sense that they had limited ability to really do what they wanted to do because the sanctions were hurting them. The financing was more difficult to be able to move money in and out. They looked at different ways to evade sanctions through some of these Latin American countries. Ecuador played a prominent role in that. But they found very creative ways to get around them. One example, this is where I think that, that when I said Russia, China, Iran, that all kind of converges. Well, a lot of the transfers that were coming from Iran to Ecuador and Iran to Venezuela were coming through Chinese banks. So Iran would send the money to China through their oil agreements. Then China has plenty of agreements with these countries, would send the money to Latin America, to Venezuela or Ecuador, and kind of triangulate the money so that it doesn't look like it's sanctioned funds. That can change because when we did the majority of this investigation, Iran was heavily sanctioned. It was kind of viewed as a pariah in the international order. We're in a negotiation right now with Iran over the nuclear program. We're discussing, diminishing sanctions and alleviating a lot of that pressure, economic pressure. So, in this time, if Iran is successful at convincing the West and the world that they are a legitimate player and they want nuclear power for peaceful purposes, you could see them have more access to cash and different financial systems. And in that sense, I think they'd be able to fulfill a lot of the agreements they have in Latin America. And the last question about their legitimacy, yeah, it's true. I mean, the Amia case, actually, if you look at it kind of like on that trend line, the Amia case hurt them. It pushed them back. 10 years, it took Hugo Chavez to come to power before they were able to really re-engage like they wanted to. They had some momentum, and then they hit the Amia, and then they kind of stayed quiet for about a decade, and then Hugo Chavez came, and then they re-engaged. If there's a terrorist attack today in Latin America for whatever reason, sponsored by Iran, yeah, granted, it's going to cause them a whole lot of problems, but they make that calculus. They make that calculus based on their objectives and their intentions in the region and globally. The Amia attack, for example, happened, at least according to the Argentine prosecutors' investigation, because Argentina was supposed to share nuclear technology with Iran, and they reneged on that deal. So Iran, I mean, they play hardball. And so when we're talking about, big negotiations like this taking place in Geneva, I get very worried. Because if those negotiations fail, or they don't go right, or whatever happens, or somebody says something that doesn't play through the way Iran likes to see the outcome, they're fully capable of doing what they need to do in Latin America. Now they'll make that calculus as to whether they think that's beneficial or not for their objectives. I can tell you, I think it'd be detrimental, but I'm not. Yeah, I told her.
My name is Tyler Duffbach. I'm an intern with IWP. Given everything that's happening in the Middle East concerning Iran, between their domestic nuclear program, the chaos in Iraq and Syria, and domestic politics in Lebanon concerning Hezbollah, how high of a priority is Latin America for Iran at this moment?
Okay. Probably have a bit of a skewed opinion on that, just because I come at this more as a Latin American than as an Iran expert. But if you look at their statements of intent, their declarations, very high. Hassan Rouhani himself, even I think it was within a week of his inauguration, said that had a delegation from the Arab countries come to Tehran and greeted them personally and said that we're going to maintain this relationship. I don't want you to worry. This wasn't just an Ahmadinejad project. Since then, just in this year, there have been give or take about 8 or 9 high-level delegations from Iran to Latin America. They created these things called parliamentary friendship groups, where they go out and they create members of their parliament that are closely tied to the clergy that come down to Latin America and establish relationships with congressmen and parliamentarians from Latin America. They're doing that very active. They haven't slowed down. From my co-editor, Alon Berman, is actually an Iran expert, And I take a lot of his word for understanding what Iran's global ambitions are. And he tells me that he hasn't seen this level of activity in any other region. So my sense is that it's very high.
Just because, and the reason why I ask it, just because it seems like, just concerning their region, they have their hands full with everything that's going on. So that seems, just simplistically maybe, it seems as though that would impede their ability to express geopolitical influence outside of their region.
Yeah, that's true. I think maybe you could think about it this way. If you look at Iran on the map in the Middle East, right? Actually, I have this somewhere here in the slide, but if you look at them on the map in the Middle East, if you surround all the countries that are surrounding them, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Turkey, Afghanistan, U.S. presence is very visible. They see us all the time, everywhere. So for them, it's a full-time problem. The United States engagement in the Middle East is a full-time problem that they're constantly figuring out how to get around. If you look at our region, Canada, Mexico, I mean, we have problems, but they're not like that. So while we can afford to think part-time about Iran, they can't afford that on us. And so over the last decade, they've made that calculus to say they want to diminish that disadvantage. But they can't do what the United States does. They can't send carriers to the Caribbean or send, a bunch of military outposts all throughout the countries. They have to do it in an asymmetric nature. They have to do it through the mosques, the cultural centers. They have to do it through the commercial agreements. But they are building. And intelligence, they say, for intelligence I used to work in for several years, they say that intelligence drives operations and that intelligence is meant to prepare the battle space. So if you're doing high-level intelligence, I'm not talking about just counter-espionage or just surveillance. If you're doing full-game sourcing and elicitation operations that are at a very high level, it's usually because you're preparing for a larger operation. So in my sense, a lot of this may be intelligence-related, soft subversion, but it's meant to do more in the future.
Hi, Carl Galvin, a retired customs agent. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, you can go ahead.
No, I do, please.
Alicia from the Asia Group. In regards to what you mentioned earlier in Brazil's position and trying to be the middleman and not taking too many sides, considering its energy capacity and Iran's needs and expansion in the energy sector, as well as Brazil's close borders with Bolivia. Bolivia has 70% of lithium, at least. Do you think that Iran will be focusing more on Bolivia and Brazil, or is it still going to be focusing on Venezuela because of its close relations with the government?
Iran's always focused on Brazil. Brazil has been their geopolitical prize for years. They've had some engagements, they had some success under the Lula administration. Lula actually was very warm and welcome to the Iranian presence. Dilma has been less so, but that's on the surface. The way the Brazilian government described it to me, they say, while there's a change on the retail, there's no change on the wholesale. So while Brazilian government may say, no, we don't accept a meeting without Ahmadinejad or maybe Rouhani if he was to come, in the lower levels of government, they're very much engaged, consistent. There's a huge Palestinian, Lebanese lobby in Brazil that constantly projects different types of projects in the country. There's a large Islamic population that they have a lot of room to maneuver. But I'd say it's very important to them. Brazil plays a key role in one sense that, there are two big sporting events, one just passed, one coming up, the World Cup and the Summer Olympics. One of the biggest weaknesses, we cover this in the last chapter of the book, where Ramin and Alam kind of go through the policy aspect of it. One of the biggest weaknesses to all this activity is the fact that Latin American countries don't have an anti-terrorism framework. They don't consider Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda terrorists. They look at that just as another criminal group or as a problem for the U.S., but not for them. In Brazil, we actively tried to get them to adopt legislation to create that legal framework. There's actually 6 bills in the Chamber of Deputies for the Brazilian Parliament. The one more prominent one that really was introduced last year that would designate, do something similar to what we did here with the State Department with the Foreign Terrorist Organizations list that gives law enforcement a lot of other additional capacities. But the Brazilian government won't do it. I'm not convinced they won't do it in the future. I hope they would, but it's very difficult. And Brazil would make you believe that they'll do a lot, but when it comes down to putting pen to paper, they'll do very little. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I'll say like this: Brazil, it's a challenge but an opportunity for the United States. If we really want to neutralize this threat, I think we need to engage Brazil very carefully and very effectively.
Hi, Carl Galvin. Since the U.S.
affiliation.
Retired U.S. Customs agent and a student here as well. Since the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the Bretton Woods International Monetary Agreement back in '71, we've kind of weaponized our system of credit. And in instances like Iran, we've just sort of turned the switch and cut them off from Western banking. And I think that's had an effect where we've driven them into seeking relationships with many other countries and caused many other countries to be skeptical about not having kind of a backup. I wonder if in your communications with people from these various countries, do you sense an interest in moving forward to a new Bretton Woods kind of agreement that would stabilize?
On the U.S. side?
Well, either from the U.S. side or from the side of other countries.
Yeah, so nothing that's similar to the Bretton Woods system, but there are monetary systems that are being developed in Latin America that have been used in the past for the benefit of Iran, mainly to evade sanctions at the time, but can be used as a way to establish commercial frameworks that can move stuff in and out without the supervision of financial authorities that are generally Western or U.S. led. One country specific really takes the lead in that role is Ecuador. So the biggest complaint, and this is not just Iran, this is actually Russia, this is China, who does a lot of business in Latin America. China has probably become the second largest trade partner for many countries in the region. One of the biggest complaints is the hegemony of the U.S. dollar in trade transactions. So everything that comes in and out of America, one way or the other, has to be pegged to the dollar. The price of oil is pegged to the dollar, and it limits their ability to move and maneuver how they would wish. So they've introduced this idea of creating an alternative framework, a monetary framework. The BRIC banks that was opened in Sao Paulo just earlier this year was a part of that discussion. I think China made the initial deposit of $2 billion. And Ecuador took a leading role in that. So the two South American economic frameworks that exist, one's called UNASUR, the other's called Mercosur. The idea is they're going to merge the two and peg them to a virtual currency, kind of like a Bitcoin, but a government-run Bitcoin, to basically make that as an accounting system for the BRIC bank. That would completely take the dollar out of the question. It would allow like the renminbi to be the major trade sponsor for Brazil, for Bolivia, for Ecuador, and others. And they're actively in the works. If you look at Ecuador today, they've introduced this new electronic currency. They introduced a new law. I just came back from Ecuador yesterday. They introduced a new law it's called the Financial Panic Law, which is a very interesting law. You've probably heard of some of the oppression on journalists in Latin America, and Venezuela, and Ecuador. But this law actually says if any, not just a journalist, if any individual in the country makes a statement that creates any source of financial panic, you're incarcerated for a minimum of 7 years. So that means like if you're an economist and you say, our outlook isn't good, our deficit's high, and we might go into shortages in the near future, you could go to jail. So to me that's a part of introducing this new framework, this new monetary framework. And for those, many of you probably are scholars of war and scholars of warfare, right? The 5 domains of war, traditional 5 domains of war, air, sea, land, and space, cyber. The 6th domain, which isn't talked about as much, economic, is I think more prevalent in Latin America. That's where a lot of that economic warfare takes place, and monetary discussions are part of it.
Thank you.
Nancy Megas from the Center for Security Policy. Joseph, thank you very much. It's an excellent presentation. Some people believe that Iran is just strategically placing itself there in case of some kind of conflict, future conflict with the United States, and other people believe that Iran is there as a way to do harm to the United States. What is your view?
My view is that Iran is operating to change the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. They're one aspect of that, one player in that game. I think China and Russia are also doing the same. And the most interesting thing to me at this point of my research, because I've done a lot on Iran, but what really interests me now is the convergence of those 3 actors in Latin America and how they're actually shaping and reshaping the region so that it goes against U.S. interests. Not just U.S. interests in the sense of trade and commerce, but also U.S. military interests. Our Southern Command, or our main combatant command that monitors and engages Latin America, has openly said this. Matter of fact, in that State Department report, the one that said Iran's impact or influence was waning or declining, the one element of government that said that's not our assessment was Southern Command. Southern Command said that's not how we see things, and I've spoken to several folks at Southern Command, Special Operations Command, and they all kind of have that same assessment, that they think that this is a project that reshapes the balance of power. Now, as far as an imminent threat, imminent attack, it's very difficult to say because you don't know what's in Iran's head. I could pretend like I could think like an Ayatollah, but I really don't. And the reality is that the calculations that they make on how they want to see their power projected is way different than what I think it could be. Now, people that do study them better, I think, would know that. I think the part of that threat that's underestimated isn't the part that comes from Iran, it's the part that comes from Latin America. Because if there was no ALBA, there would be no really Iran in Latin America. I mean, they would be the same way they were before Ami. They could pull off a bombing or something, but they wouldn't be able to do what they're doing today. These ALBA countries, which you know very well, Nancy, Evo Morales is of Bolivia, these Ecuadors of Rafael Correa of Ecuador, and these others. These are individuals that, if you study their mindsets, do view themselves as, at some point in the future, having a confrontation with the U.S. Hugo Chavez used to say this very vocally. He used to say that, you know, at some point, some people thought it was propaganda to get his people kind of like united, but I don't know. I think he really did believe that. I think he did believe that at some point that, you know, in order to have this Bolivarian project, this 21st century socialist revolution, that he'll have to confront the West at some point. But they're not going to do it, you know, the way we think they will do it, with, you know, sending carriers to Florida. They'll do it some other way.
Evgeny Novikov, Center for Security of Free Society. My question is about Russia. You know, the Latin America for Soviet Union and now for Russia was always considered, especially for security and for intelligence sources, Soviet and Russian, as a base for anti-American activities. Most sleeping agents came to the United States through Latin American countries. And now, after the sanctions which was imposed on Russia, Russia is paying a great attention to the Latin American countries. And especially not only intelligence services of Russia is paying attention, but also military-industrial complex. You know, they are moving into Central American countries, especially in Venezuela. My question is, do you notice any cooperation between the Russian, and especially intelligence Russian, and the military-industrial complex Russian, and cooperation with their counterparts in Iran, with the Iranian intelligence and Iranian military-industrial complex? Maybe, you know, when they're creating these industrial military enterprises in Latin American countries, maybe Russian also penetrating there, and they share their, you know, technology, military technology there. Yes.
Yeah, intelligence sharing, I'm sure, is taking place. Intelligence, like you know, again, is a commodity, sold, bartered, exchanged. I'm sure that happens. I don't have any evidence, or I haven't seen Russian-Iranian cooperation in Latin America. I wouldn't discount it, but I haven't seen it. I also haven't been looking specifically for it. But I think the points of nexus that you might be alluding to is the oil industry. So Latin America, like you know, many other parts of the developing world, has a lot of oil. Many of these countries are commodity countries that are dependent on exports. Oil being one of them, one of the major ones. Venezuela was a petroeconomy. You know, Ecuador is kind of a petroeconomy. Bolivia has a significant amount of oil. These are three of the countries that are probably the most prominent when it comes to Iran-Latin America relationship. And so what I seen with Iran was that they would use those energy agreements and those energy frameworks to establish a cover and plausible deniability for military transfers that are sanctioned as of today. You know, Russia also has several agreements with those same energy companies. Gazprom, for instance, has several agreements with PDVSA in Venezuela, as well as with Petroandino in Ecuador. So, I mean, that's where I would look. I would look at the energy sector and see where those try to map that maze and see where Russia fits into it.
We have time for one more question.
Derek Wellington, Missouri State. My question is on Hezbollah and its role in Latin America. Is it working as a proxy of Iran, or does it have its own agenda?
I think Hezbollah is proven to be a proxy for Iran. In Latin America particularly, they get a lot of command and control from Iran. Hezbollah was the one that carried out the Ami attack, but it was completely coordinated, funded, planned, and prepared by the Iranian embassy in Buenos Aires. If you look at that old map of all those centers, all those embassies, I'm sorry, right, that are generally Iranian-run, Iranian embassies, they controlled all the mosque and culture centers, which are generally Lebanese or Syrian-run, which are mainly Hezbollah affiliate. In that sense, I'd say that they do have a proxy-type relationship where they're operating. But when it comes to other activities, more illicit criminal activities, they kind of have their own domain, mainly in the narco-trafficking realm. You know, I'm sure you know Hezbollah was started as a narco-terrorist organization. They used to run opium out the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. But when Iran became a primary sponsor of their activity, they depended less on the narco industry and depended more on state subsidy. With the sanctions, I think that's somewhat changed. And so what you're seeing is Hezbollah engaged a lot in narco trafficking. And I don't think Iran's heavily involved in that. At least I wouldn't see why they would be. But Hezbollah is definitely well entrenched with the cartels in Mexico, with the FARC in Colombia, with the Colombian drug networks, and they get a piece of that pie. I mean, all the narcotics that have to go from Latin America to Europe pass in one way or the other to the Middle East and North Africa. Some of that's territory that's controlled by Al Qaeda and their affiliates, and another that's territory controlled by Hezbollah. So I guess it's both. When it comes to narco trafficking, I think they have some autonomy and they do it more for their interest, revenue, more than anything else. But when it comes to this type of stuff, where there's basically need to be served as a line of defense or a line of an operational presence, I think Iran mandates that. And Quds Force is known to be the trainers and preparers of Hezbollah operations, so the Quds is very active in Latin America.
Thank you very much.